Hey guys, welcome to another video. Today we're going to talk about the Beyerdynamic Amiron Home. This is a 250 ohm dynamic driver open back headphone that comes in right at around $500 to $600. So let's take a look. This video is made possible by the folks over at headphones.com. You can check out my written comments in the community section there and see what other people are saying as well. So right away, the question on everybody's mind when it comes to this headphone is, do I hate this as much as other reviewers hate this? And my answer is actually no, but I do still hate this. And I'll explain why when we talk about how it sounds. But first, let me talk about the build quality, design, and comfort. This is one of the best built and designed headphones, and it's also one of the most comfortable that I've ever had the pleasure of using. This is how I want all of my headphones to look, feel, and weigh. I have nothing bad to say about any of it. I'd previously reviewed the DT1990 Pro, and I found that the clamp force for that one was a little bit tight. And with this one, it's dramatically improved. And on top of it, the build quality here almost feels a little bit better even than that one. It is an open back, so sound does leak out, but really not that much. And it's significantly less. So I'd consider this almost more like a semi-open back. And just the overall comfort for the headband piece and the cups is a dramatic improvement over what I was used to and what I was expecting. Now, this is marketed as the consumer home listening environment headphone, where the DT1990 Pro is the studio headphone, and so the comfort benefits that this enjoys are likely due to them wanting it to coincide with a different listening environment, and in that sense they've succeeded. Unfortunately, they haven't succeeded when it comes to that same distinction in terms of sound quality. My expectation coming into this was unfortunately a little bit biased, and I'm usually the kind of person who is a little bit of a contrarian, and I like to try and identify things that maybe other people haven't talked about or haven't mentioned as strongly. And unfortunately, with the Amiron Home, I think it does deserve quite a bit of the criticism that it gets. The detail retrieval on first listen for this headphone is actually reasonable. Where it suffers is in what I'm going to describe here as microdynamics. So to explain what I mean by that, at just about every point in the frequency response range, you'll get a lot of the details coming through from the music that you're listening to. However, what you don't get is the nuance of the resonances or anything beyond just the default tone, if that makes sense. Think about what happens when you look at a color gradient where you don't actually have that many color intervals. So your overall number of colors is very low. The distinction between one color and another color is very obvious, and there's no room for the smaller gradations of color in between. And that's how I feel about this headphone and where its detail comes across. So for the bass frequencies, you get a sort of a dry thud. In the treble, it doesn't have a frequency response related edge to it, but you don't really quite get the nuance of the sparkle that you want. And this has become more evident to me after listening to some higher end headphones that really shine in that regard, like some of the stuff from Hi-Fi Man, for example, with both the Aria and the HE1000 SE. Those do that kind of nuance quality extremely well, and so do all kinds of other headphones that even come in and around this price. So while I don't think it's the detail retrieval specifically as far as getting the details from your mix that are lacking here, it's that pretty much everything about the details that you're listening to is a little bit boring. For speed, I didn't find the Amiron Home to be as bad as what I was expecting. I actually didn't mind the speed here. I think it's relatively in line with other headphones at its price. Especially those that aren't planars. So we're talking, it's pretty close to what's going on with the 660S. But unfortunately, the tonality here makes it so that the bass isn't particularly tight. And we'll talk about that when it comes to the tonality. For soundstage and imaging, that is the shining quality of this headphone. It does extremely well for stage and imaging at this price. In my opinion, this might even be a little bit better than the DT1990 Pro when it comes to imaging or like image distinction. maybe not quite as spacious on the stage, but not too far off either. And it did feel relatively airy and open, so I didn't have a problem with that at all. As far as timbre goes, this feels just like a natural sounding headphone, maybe not quite on the same level as the HD650s and those, but I didn't have a problem there either. When looking at the tonality here with the HEQ compensation, you can see that the sub bass sits a bit lower than the upper bass, which does bleed into the mid-range a bit, and this is what causes it to be a little bit on the bloated and loose side for the bass, and then you get a recession down into the upper mid-range and lower treble. The peak here, as measured on this rig, is not as dramatic as it is on the DT1990 Pro, which I measured on the same rig. And with that one, it was pretty much flat all across the board until around 8.5K and then just went straight up. With this one, there's a much more gradual elevation to 8.5K hertz. And to me, that actually sounds less aggressive. It sounds a little bit more focused. And so while this could be about 5 dB lower, if not more so, I don't dislike the overall shape of the elevation. And then looking at the HPN compensation, you can see again, this is where it's a little bit more dramatic and obvious. This peak, again, the shape isn't the worst, but now we're looking at the HPN compensation where it's clearly too much, right? This is closer to a diffuse field target, and it's bright even on that. Now going back to the HEQ compensation, which is closer to the Harman target, this isn't the worst that I've ever seen, but unfortunately the technical ability of this headphone doesn't allow it to cheat like other headphones that perform better can. So when you get a frequency response like this for a headphone that really doesn't shine on the technical detail retrieval front, it makes it so that some of these issues are a little bit more problematic than they might otherwise seem. So while this isn't the worst that I've heard for frequency response, it's not great, and on top of it, the lack of the dynamic capabilities for detail make it so that it actually sounds even worse than it measures. When trying to EQ this, I bumped down the consonant range quite substantially, and then that actually made things sound quite a bit better. The 2K dip here I'm not as concerned about, but it would be nice if the bass to upper mid-range was a little bit more linear. This looks a little bit similar to maybe like a more bloated DT990 that isn't perhaps as aggressively sharp. So, you know, if you're a fan of the DT990, you might not dislike this as much, but for me, this just is not all that great. And in some ways, I would take the DT1990 over this one because I would only have to EQ one thing with the DT1990 Pro, whereas with this, I don't even know how I would begin to adjust the bass to mid-range section, which is just a little bit wonky on top of whatever is going on with this mountain. So this is V-shaped in a way that really doesn't do any favors to either of the emphasized regions. You know, there's other headphones that are V-shaped that actually do a really good job at detail retrieval capabilities, like for example the Focal Stellia. That's again where that headphone is able to get away with things that this one can't because of the detail retrieval capabilities and the dynamics and all the technical performance of that headphone. So with the Amiron Home, unfortunately, it does not allow it to get away with this kind of tonality. So when I think about this headphone and what it's aiming to achieve, I think it does so in terms of its comfort and build quality and all of this. When you're wearing it, it feels great actually, and it's a really enjoyable, easy, relaxing experience of having this on your head for a long period of time, and there's no problem there. And it's considerably better than what was going on with the DT1990 Pro, and so in that sense it is made for distinctly different audiences. But unfortunately, the tuning of this headphone, coupled with its lack of dynamics, microdynamics, is a little bit boring. The tonality in particular, with that withdrawn quality in the upper mid-range and lower treble, followed by a fairly substantial amount of sibilance, it does tend to be a little bit problematic. What I did notice is that the shape of the treble peak is a shape that I don't entirely dislike. It's just too much. It's just too high. And if that were reduced, if it didn't peak where it does, I wouldn't have a problem with this. But because it cranks it up by like, an extra 5 dB, it makes it so it's a little bit on the sibilant side. I do almost feel like the DT1990 Pro that I evaluated had more sibilance than this. And I think my measurements actually show this as well. Whereas this one, it maybe hits the same elevation, but because of the shape of the peak, it's more gradual on the Amiron Home. And so for that reason, I don't mind the sibilance on this quite so much. But then you get into this whole lack of microdynamics in the treble as well. And while I don't find it to be all that over sharpened like I did with the DT1990 Pro, it does leave a little bit to be desired when it comes to any of that nuance or textured or layered quality that just isn't there. And after you're used to hearing that with other headphones, it makes it so that everything just is a little bit on the boring side. And I find that that's really not appropriate for this price. Still, as much as I am not a fan of this headphone, it's not the worst headphone that I've ever heard. It definitely doesn't punch above its price point by any stretch, and there are cheaper headphones like both the HD6XX and the Sundara that outperform this. So I would take either of those over this one, even though there are certain categories where this does perform better than those two. But it is also better than headphones that I've evaluated that are more expensive than this. Like, for example, the Final Audio Sonorous 4 and 6 and the AudioQuest Nighthawk. This has actually a better tonality than those, even though those might be a little bit more interesting from a dynamics point of view. The other thing to keep in mind is that not everybody notices the dynamics thing as strongly as other people do. And my experience at first was, oh no, this is actually all right. And then I started listening for specific things, and I realized, oh, this is actually, it's very flat in a bad sense. There's no body or weight to anything. It has no problem representing all of the different pieces in your mix. It's just that there isn't any nuance to the representation. There's not all those in-between colors for the sound. There's not all those in-between intervals for volume for the sound like you would hope that there is. Once you do EQ things, it does sound better, but it's not something that fixes those performance qualities. So on the whole, in conclusion, I don't think this is worth it, and I don't recommend this over those other headphones like the HD6XX, even the 660S, or the Hi-Fi Man Sundara. I think those three are still going to be the better choices when it comes to the upper mid-fi category. And I know that for some of them, they're actually quite a bit less expensive. For the 6XX, it's like $220, and the Sundara is around $350. So that's quite a bit less expensive than this. And I think both of those are quite a bit better as far as performance goes. So that does it for this review. Thanks for taking the time to watch this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.